In mid-2014, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, known otherwise as the terrorist group ISIS, had succeeded in capturing new territory across parts of Iraq and Syria. By exploiting the political instability in Iraq, militants were able to launch an offensive across the northern sections of the country, as well as several Syrian strongholds, where they aimed to establish a caliphate, a state to be governed by Sharia law. In order to achieve their goal, these terrorists employed brutal shock tactics, including public killings and executions, the detonation of explosives attached to vehicles, and kidnapping for ransom money, which would go on to fund their conquest. The declaration of the Islamic State as a caliphate would draw in a cast of foreign fighters, who flocked to Iraq and Syria to join ISIS, as they attempted to spread their influence far and wide. Amidst ISIS's continuing human rights violations and crimes against humanity, the United Kingdom's Royal Air Force attempted to drop humanitarian aid to the Yazidi people of northern Iraq, who were being targeted by the Islamic State in a vicious genocide. What started as a simple airdrop would turn into a decade-long operation to intervene in the Islamic State's plans, as the British Army, Royal Air Force and Royal Navy contributed with ground support, airstrikes and reconnaissance. This would be a massive operation, known as Operation Shader, that would see hundreds of millions of pounds worth of aid sent to Iraq and Syria, while a reported 4,300 enemy fighters were killed in the process. In today's video, we will be breaking down the key events of Operation Shader, taking a look at just how it played out in both Iraq and Syria. We will first examine the events that took place in Iraq during the operation, before moving on to what happened in Syria and beyond. This is a journey that will take us from the summer of 2014 to as recently as the summer of 2024, as we examine the facts and figures of what the Royal Air Force described as the most intense flying mission they had undertaken in 25 years. This is Operation Shader. Welcome to Wars of the World. After the Islamic State took control of northern Iraq in 2014, the fractured Iraqi government requested the assistance of the United States, calling for airstrikes on land that was now controlled by ISIS. In October of that year, the Americans would support the Iraqis with the establishment of the Combined Joint Task Force, Operation Inherent Resolve, and they aimed to destroy the Islamic State once and for all. The Americans were keen to see this as a multinational effort, however. In the 2014 NATO summit, which was held in Newport, Wales, United States Secretary of State John Kerry encouraged several allied countries to form a military coalition in order to bring ISIS to its knees. Specifically, he began to press ministers from the United Kingdom, Australia, France, Canada, Denmark, Germany, Turkey and Italy to do so. Many of these countries would intervene and even work together to suppress the rising threat of the Islamic State over the course of the next decade. But primarily, Operation Shader was the work of the British Army, the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy. Meanwhile, in Iraq, the Islamic State had begun their genocide of the Yazidi people, an indigenous group of Kurdish-speaking people who practice Yazidism, a form of traditional religion with origins in Iran. In an attempt to force all of the people of ISIS's territories under the religion of Islam, the militants began kidnapping and trafficking Yazidi women and girls, and killed up to 5,000 men. When trafficked, many of the victims would be forced into ISIS conversion camps, where they would be forced to convert. Many of the persecuted Yazidis fled to Iraq's Kurdistan region, which had not yet come under the control of the Islamic State. The genocide drew international attention, and the United Nations was soon accusing ISIS of crimes against humanity and serious violations of human rights. Amongst those who attempted to reach northern Iraq to airdrop humanitarian aid were the British Royal Air Force, the first of which was conducted on the 9th of August 2014. 2 Lockheed C-130 Hercules aircraft made the first trip, and successfully dropped aid into the Sinjar Mountains, where many Yazidis were located. While these airdrops were ongoing, the United Kingdom's Ministry of Defence announced that several Tornado GR-4 strike aircraft will be accompanying the aid drops, in order to provide reconnaissance of possible ISIS positions below, thus allowing the aid to be delivered more reliably. Alongside them will be 4 Chinook transport helicopters, in case refugee rescue missions were needed to be carried out. Across the next few days, up until the 14th of August, the RAF would continue to provide aid to the displaced Yazidis on the ground, but they soon shifted their focus to the surveillance of ISIS movements and activity. These new plans saw not only the Tornadoes deployed to gather intelligence, but also Reapers, Sentinels, Shadows, and Sentries. These planes would patrol the skies over northern Iraq and Syria, monitoring any changes in terrorist behaviour over the coming weeks and months. There were no active plans for the British to engage in combat with the Islamic State up until this point. The Tornadoes were under orders not to engage in airstrikes, as the Parliament had not approved them, and the Defence Secretary, Michael Fallon, had said that while Britain would welcome airstrikes and ground operations, they had not been asked to launch them. All of this changed, however, when British Prime Minister David Cameron recalled Parliament to debate the authorisation of airstrikes against ISIS on the 26th of December 2014. Cameron had reported that the Iraqi government had requested British airstrikes to help them combat the brutal terrorist organisation that was the Islamic State, and also expressed concerns that the group would be a threat to the safety of the United Kingdom if the military remained dormant. After 7 hours, Parliament voted in favour of the airstrikes going ahead. 524 votes supported the strikes, versus just 43 that did not. Almost immediately after Parliament had approved the airstrikes to take place in northern Iraq, plans were set in place to launch the offensive as soon as possible. 6 Tornado GR-4s stationed at RAF Akrotiri in Cyprus would be sent to Iraq to commence the strikes, 2 of which did so on the 13th of September 2014. Intelligence had revealed the position of several ISIS heavy weapons, which the Tornadoes were able to successfully destroy using a laser-guided bomb, while a nearby armed truck launched a Brimstone homing missile to finish the job. 2 more Tornadoes, along with several unmanned MQ-9 Reapers, joined Operation Shader in the following October, the latter of which successfully targeted an ISIS position with missile fire on the 10th of that month. Michael Fallon, the UK's Defence Secretary, had noted that by the end of the year, the RAF had conducted a huge number of missions across northern Iraq, second only in number to those carried out by the United States. Meanwhile, in October of 2014, training missions had begun in Erbil, Iraq, to provide the Iraqi Peshmerga with the knowledge on how to use British heavy machine guns. Initially, just 12 British soldiers were sent to train the Iraqis on how to use these guns, but their numbers were quickly increased. 12 turned to 50, which turned to 100, and eventually to 300 by 2016. Around 31,000 Peshmerga fighters were trained on how to use these heavy weapons against ISIS, giving local forces a greater chance to defend themselves against the ongoing terrorist threat. Once the airstrikes had begun, however, concerns arose amongst the British public surrounding possibilities of mission creep. This is the process whereby successful operations in a war lead to more ambitious and strenuous operations as the mission expands far beyond its initial goal and scope. Mission creep has been experienced in the Iraq War and the war in Afghanistan, and the public were keen to avoid the same thing from happening again. Parliament maintained that the ground troops would not be deployed to fight ISIS in northern Iraq, and that they would be focusing on only training the Iraqi fighters. The only time that Parliament would rescind this was a 2014 mission which saw the deployment of the 2nd Battalion Royal Yorkshire Regiment to Erbil to secure a helicopter landing area for a refugee extraction. The soldiers were in and out in just 24 hours. While there is large-scale speculation that the British Special Forces may have been involved in ground offences against ISIS during Operation Shader, regular ground forces were largely utilised only for training and support purposes. Shortly after 1 year of Operation Shader had elapsed, the Tornadoes and Reapers that were sent into ISIS-controlled lands had conducted over 1,300 individual missions. This included around 300 airstrikes, raining down 311 AGM-114 Hellfire missiles, 117 Brimstone missiles, and 540 Paveway 4 laser-guided bombs. Collectively, these airstrikes, by January of 2016, are believed to have killed 330 Islamic State fighters. Combined with the efforts of the United States, a dent was beginning to be etched into the flank of a seriously dangerous terrorist organization. The next notable airstrike attack came in June of 2016, when the Royal Air Force bombarded a concrete bunker situated towards the western reaches of Iraq, utilizing Storm Shadow cruise missiles. This bunker was being used as a weapons storage facility for the Islamic State, and by taking it out, British forces will be able to halt the distribution of heavy guns amongst nearby terrorist militants. Storm Shadow missiles, which travel at speeds of over 600 miles an hour when launched, are able to penetrate deep within their targets before detonating, thanks to their two-stage warhead system. And that's exactly how they were used against this weapon bunker in question. This was the first time that the United Kingdom had used these weapons in their efforts for Operation Shader. All 4 of the missiles fired scored direct hits on the bunker, and the airstrike was deemed a success. While the RAF continued to conduct airstrikes on Islamic State territory, late 2016 to early 2017 saw the deployment of many engineers to assist with the construction of training facilities at the Iraqi Al-Assad Air Base. Around this time, around 600 British personnel, either directly or indirectly, were contributing to the training of thousands upon thousands of Iraqi soldiers, who were able to take the fight to ISIS at ground level. For the most part, the training programs, which were carried out across a number of Iraqi bases, were a great success. But in January of 2017, disaster struck. Lance Corporal Scott Hetherington, who was stationed at Camp Taji in Iraq, was accidentally killed by his close friend Lance Corporal Colin Thika. Reportedly, the two, who were best friends, were playing around while cleaning their service pistols. Thika, who had not realized he had made his gun ready to fire, with a round in the chamber, fired a single shot into the chest of Hetherington when he jokingly pulled the trigger, killing him. Thika would subsequently be sentenced to 3 years in prison, admitting to manslaughter by gross negligence. The training program itself would actually be temporarily suspended in January of 2020, when tensions began to rise between Iran and the United States, as a result of the airstrike on Baghdad International Airport. United States President Donald Trump had ordered the strike to be carried out, and Iranian commander Qasem Soleimani was killed as a result. Safety concerns had arose, meaning that British troops could not reliably train further Iraqi soldiers with the risk of a new conflict emerging so close to their bases. In addition, the COVID-19 pandemic had caused a further scale down of the training program, as to not put the soldiers at risk before they could even fire their weapons. Moreover, in the March of 2020, an Iranian-backed militia orchestrated a rocket attack on Camp Taji, killing 3 soldiers, one of whom was British Lance Corporal Brodie Gillen. The Americans retaliated on the group responsible with an airstrike, and the training program, while still operational, would not see nearly as much traction as it did towards the start of Operation Shader. Following a series of successful offensives against ISIS in Syria, the RAF toned down the scale of their flying missions from 2019 to the April of 2020. For 9 months, Britain put their airstrikes on a hiatus, recommencing them with the introduction of Eurofighter Typhoons, as well as Reapers, in the lands north of Baghdad. These strikes saw the Royal Air Force target ISIS-owned buildings in the areas of Tuz-Kerma and Kirkuk, deep within the mountains. Pave Wave 4 laser-guided bombs were used once again to target the terrorists within these buildings, after ensuring that no civilian casualties would be risked by doing so. Following this return to bombarding the Islamic State from above, the RAF continued to carry out up to 40 airstrikes until July of 2020. The prolific airstrikes continued into 2021, when Storm Shadow missiles were used once more to target ISIS militants hiding out in caves across the mountains of northern Iraq. The airstrikes between 2019 and 2021 are believed to have killed at least 27 members of ISIS, injuring an additional 4. Following 2021, the airstrikes died down once more. Only 2 strikes occurred across the entirety of 2022, and 2 notable strikes in 2023 managed to hit major ISIS targets while supporting the Iraqi security forces. Then, in the April of 2024, British Typhoons struck an ISIS rocket launcher that had been gunning for members of the coalition forces in the mountains of northern Iraq. It is believed that ISIS lost much of their ground in Iraq by 2017, when Iraqi Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi announced that the Islamic State had been completely evicted from the country. UK officials, however, remained confident that ISIS was still a huge threat to the UK, and they did not bring Iraq's front of Operation Shader to a close until September of 2024. The finale of the operation in Iraq saw the United Kingdom transitioning into more of a security role than an outright offensive one, and further missions, including airstrikes, have since stopped. Despite the end of Operation Shader, however, Royal Air Force planes still patrol over the mountains of northern Iraq today, and they will likely continue to do so for the foreseeable future. Syria's place in Operation Shader can be traced back to 2013, before the Yazidi genocide and before ISIS could capture new swathes of land in the Middle East. On the 21st of August 2013, the military forces of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, acting during the Syrian civil war, launched a series of rockets into two opposition-controlled areas around the capital city of Damascus. These rockets contained the extremely toxic nerve agent sarin, which can quickly cause death by asphyxiation as the affected individual struggles to control their throat muscles. While the exact death toll from this chemical attack is unknown, anywhere from between 281 to 1,729 people are believed to have died as a result of it. This would be the single deadliest use of chemical weapons since the Iran-Iraq War, which spanned much of the 1980s. International attention soon turned towards Syria following this attack, and the House of Commons under Prime Minister David Cameron took a vote on whether or not military action against al-Assad's forces should be taken. Ultimately, the decision was made not to move forward with an offensive in Syria, an action that was viewed as a mistake and a defeat for Cameron amongst the British media. Shortly after the ruling, Cameron's spokesman did insist that while action against the Syrian government would not be taken, action against terrorist forces in Syria may still be considered. To go ahead with this, Cameron would have needed the approval of another House of Commons vote, unless he was acting to prevent a humanitarian disaster in Syria. The situation reached a boiling point when later into 2013, ISIS terrorists kidnapped two British humanitarian aid workers in Syria, David Haines and Alan Henning, in separate incidents. These hostages would be held into 2014, and threats were made on Haines' life, urging the United States military to end its interventions in Iraq and Syria if he was ever to survive. David Cameron responded publicly, stating that the United Kingdom would not give in to their demands, and that ISIS would be squeezed out of existence as a result of their actions. ISIS would respond by releasing a horrific video showing a terrorist draped in black clothing with only his eyes being visible, going on to behead Haines. This terrorist would be named by the media as Jihadi John, who would later be identified after an intense manhunt as British national Mohammed Emwazi, who had lived in London before joining the Islamic State. ISIS would also later execute Alan Henning too, in response to the airstrikes that the UK had carried out in Iraq as part of Operation Shader. The initial surveillance missions began in 2014. The Royal Air Force had sent Reapers over from Cyprus in order to collect intelligence on ISIS militant positions. Then, in November of 2014, a United States-led mission to take out Emwazi, supported by the Royal Air Force, resulted in the death of this infamous terrorist. He had been killed in a strike as he left a building to enter his vehicle, and the Islamic State itself soon confirmed his death. That may have been the end of the story for Syria, but another terrorist attack in June of 2015 prompted the government to take action once more. This time, ISIS gunman Saifuddin Rezgui had attacked a hotel resort in Port El Kantawi, Tunisia, killing 38 people. 30 of his victims were confirmed as British holidaymakers, and soon David Cameron had begun making calls for Britain to airstrike Syrian land controlled by ISIS, acquired in their 2014 territory claims. While Royal Air Force planes had been operating in Syrian airspace, they had been primarily acting on surveillance missions or providing the United States Air Force with support. This changed in September of 2015, when a Reaper drone from the RAF killed 2 British Islamic State militants, Rahul Amin and Rayed Khan, both in Syria. Cameron explained publicly how this was an act of self-defense. The terrorists in question had reportedly been planning attacks against the United Kingdom before they were killed. The case for Britain to orchestrate airstrikes in Syria intensified again in November of 2015, when a series of coordinated terrorist attacks took place in Paris, France. This prompted Cameron to make a case to Parliament for the UK to involve themselves in striking ISIS-controlled lands. And, following a 10-hour debate in December, the House of Commons voted in his favour. Mere hours after Cameron's case for airstrikes was voted in, 4 Tornado GR4s departed from their RAF base in Cyprus to launch the first attacks on Syrian ISIS positions. In Syria, they were joined by a Reaper drone and an aerial refueling tanker, and headed for the Omar oil field in the country's eastern reaches. This oil field had been seized by the Islamic State following their territorial gains in 2014, and the area remained a huge source of income for the terrorists. Taking it out would put a thorn in the side of their plans to expand. The mission was reported as a success, and Paveway 4 laser-guided bombs were used to take out 6 key ISIS targets within the oil fields. Over the course of the next 2 years, around 85 individual airstrikes would take place against ISIS militants on Syrian soil. Only the United States were able to carry out more. In May of 2015, UK and US Special Forces, who had been operating in Al Amir, Syria, as part of Operation Shader, tracked down a prominent Islamic State leader, Abu Sayyaf. They intended to capture him, but the altercation that followed would lead to his death. Instead, the soldiers were able to capture his wife, Sayyaf, and free a young Yazidi woman who is believed to have been Sayyaf's slave. Later that year, Special Forces would also kill 6 SIS militants in a rescue operation. Ground missions were more prolific in Syria than they were in Iraq's front of Operation Shader. In 2016, it was reported that Special Forces were actually fighting on the front line, supporting the new Syrian army as they defended against ISIS-led attacks. They also reportedly helped to rebuild a military base in a village captured from ISIS with the Syrian forces, providing them with weapons and training. Relatively small numbers of UK Special Forces stayed behind at the base to help provide surveillance checks and the general defence of the area. Meanwhile, as was the case with Operation Shader in Iraq, British military trainers had been sent into nearby allied countries such as Turkey to provide support to the United States training program for members of the Syrian army. Around 75 British personnel were assigned to the training program, which provided the Syrians with knowledge surrounding small arms, medical training, and frontline tactics to better defend their country from the threat of ISIS. The training period lasted for over 3 years, in which time several British troops supported the building of a new battalion in the southern regions of Syria. The soldiers trained here were local tribal fighters from the hills and mountains, who would not be targeting ISIS, but instead would be focused on President Bashar al-Assad's military forces. As the training, airstrikes and Special Forces missions continued, the British military were able to supply anti-ISIS fighters in Syria with around 500,000 rounds of ammunition. Special Forces troops were also confirmed in 2015 to be operating in Libya, following the rise of the Islamic State in that country, while around 20 British troops were deployed to protect Tunisia's border with Libya. David Cameron had confirmed that the UK would be ready to intervene in Libya at any point, more so if there would be a threat to the lives of Britons in the region. What he needed to wait for, however, was the implementation of a stable unity government in Libya before he intervened. Nonetheless, Royal Air Force craft began operating in Libyan airspace from 2015, which was reported as being purely for reconnaissance purposes. While there were no reports of direct combat between the British military and the Islamic State that year, one incident saw a Boeing RC-135 target and jam an ISIS-run communication signal. The signal had been emitted from an Islamic State stronghold in the city of Sirte, and nothing escalated beyond this. Meanwhile, Operation Shader was beginning to prove risky in Syria by the end of the 2010s. In 2018, Special Forces Sergeant Matt Tonro would lose his life after an accidental explosion was detonated by Allied American forces in Manbij. Also killed in this explosion was United States Commando Master Sergeant Jonathan J. Dunbar. The duo were part of a joint operation in northern Syria to target ISIS militants. At the time of the disaster, Tonro was the only British soldier to have been killed in active duty during operations against the Islamic State. Additionally, in 2019, 2 British Special Forces troops would be wounded in an ISIS-led attack, whilst they provided support to the Syrian Democratic Forces' Deir ez-Zor campaign. The Islamic State lost a great deal of its territory in Syria following the Battle of Baghouz Forkani, an event that would see ISIS become reduced to small pockets of militants in the hills. Primarily, this battle was led by the Syrian Democratic Forces, and was backed up by members of the United States and British militaries. While the battle fell under the United States Combined Joint Task Force Operation Inherent Resolve, it did set the scene for things to come for the British military in Syria. The battle was reported from the angle that ISIS had been almost entirely defeated by Allied forces, and that Operation Shader would now turn its focus to stamping out those last pockets of ISIS militants hidden away in Syria. In June 2021, the Royal Navy would launch its first major contribution to Operation Shader, as it deployed UK Carrier Strike Group 21 to the Mediterranean, in order to give RAF craft better access to ISIS territories in Syria. This strike group was centered around the aircraft carrier HMS Queen Elizabeth, which was capable of transporting up to 60 aircraft. The carrier hosted both the RAF and US Marine Corps' F-355B Lightning II stealth fighters, which could conduct airstrikes across ISIS's coastal territories in Syria, while HMS Queen Elizabeth was stationed out at sea. The operations carried out in this manner were, by all accounts, a great success, and several targets were eliminated. By July of 2021, the strike group had been dismissed, but airstrikes were confirmed by the United States Naval Institute. Elsewhere, the RAF airstrikes in Syria continued up until the end of Operation Shader in 2024. In 2021, an enemy drone was shot down outside the Al Tanf military base in the south, which was orchestrated by a Typhoon, firing a short-range air-to-air ASRAAM missile. In 2022, the first and only strike came in the form of the RAF striking a target in Al-Bab, just south of Syria's border with Turkey. A prominent member of ISIS was killed in the strike, who had been creating and transporting both chemical and biological weapons. Finally, in 2024, a member of ISIS was killed in a drone strike while he travelled through an undisclosed part of the Syrian desert. Mixed opinions on the UK's instigation of Operation Shader started to pour in from the get-go. Those who opposed the country's intervention in Iraq and Syria typically did so very passionately. Before the vote even took place, Labour Party MP Rushanara Ali, a practicing Muslim, wrote to the then leader of the Labour Party, Ed Miliband, and said, quote, "I appreciate the sincerity of members of Parliament from all sides of the House who today support military action against ISIL. I know that British Muslims stand united in the total condemnation of the murders that ISIL have committed. However, there is a genuine belief in Muslim and non-Muslim communities that military action will only create further bloodshed and further pain for the people of Iraq." The British public, too, also held highly opposing opinions on the airstrikes. Many of the country's left-wing residents called MPs to vote against the airstrikes, leading to disappointment and concern when David Cameron announced that they would indeed go ahead. Operation Shader was met by some groups, such as Stop the War Coalition, with London-based protest marches in 2014 and 2015, in opposition of the government's possible decision. One politician in 2021 would become an indirect casualty of Operation Shader after he voted in favour of the airstrikes in Syria. David Amess of the Conservative Party was murdered by Islamist extremist Ali Harbi Ali, a British citizen of Somali descent. Ali was arrested at the scene after inflicting multiple stab wounds into Amess's chest, and would later be issued a whole life order. Prior to this killing, many politicians who voted, or planned to vote, in favour of the airstrikes reported that they had been sent death threats. Internationally, Britain would be commended for its work in Operation Shader. United States President Barack Obama referred to the United Kingdom as one of America's most valued partners in the anti-ISIS coalition. Elsewhere, Russian officials began to show their support for the operation, with Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov calling for more universal efforts against the Islamic State in the future. While Operation Shader was being carried out, ISIS terrorist attacks periodically continued. Reportedly, this was in retaliation for British military action in Iraq and Syria. In May of 2017, ISIS-affiliated terrorist Salman Abedi detonated a nail bomb in the Manchester Arena at the end of an Ariana Grande concert. 22 people died in the explosion, while a further 1,017 were injured. While Salman Abedi ended his life in the bombing, his brother Hashem Abedi was found to have sourced the material for the terrorists in order to make this bomb. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 55 years, this being the longest life sentence ever handed down by a British court. Earlier that year, a separate attack conducted by the terrorist Khalid Masood saw the perpetrator drive his car into a busy street of pedestrians along the south side of London's Westminster Bridge. 4 of the 50 people that he injured died. He then proceeded to stab an unarmed police officer and was shot dead by an armed officer in response. ISIS claimed responsibility for the attack, and Masood was believed to have been waging jihad in revenge for British intervention in the Middle East. Following the end of Operation Shader in 2024, there continues to be a British military presence in both Iraq and Syria. The anti-ISIS coalition officially ended their combat missions in the September of 2025, yet military support is still being provided. While Operation Shader contributed to the territorial defeat of ISIS in Iraq, Syria and Libya, the threat was not completely annihilated, and as such, a more defensive position has now been adopted to stop the Islamic State from gaining power again. The fate of their surviving members, at least for now, remains to be seen. Thank you for watching today's video. If you found it informative, please leave a like or comment down below. All of our content, from the research and script writing to the editing and narration, is completely human driven, without the use of AI. If you want to support our channel, consider subscribing and use the bell icon to get notifications on when the next War of the World video is released. Thank you for watching.